Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. What would you do if someone tried to steal what was rightfully yours? Your land, your sanctuary, your dream. For me, it wasn't just a question. It was a fight I never expected. When a power-hungry HOA president set her sights on my peaceful retreat, she unleashed a battle that would change everything. I never imagined I'd trade the hum of city life for the serenity of a secluded forest, but that's exactly what I did when I stumbled upon my little slice of heaven near Cold Springs, Washington. After 2 decades of endless meetings, traffic jams, and the constant noise of Austin, I finally reached a point where I craved something quieter, simpler. That's when I made the leap. I bought 6 untouched acres nestled at the base of the Olympic Mountains, a world away from the chaos I had always known. The land was everything I could have dreamed of, and more. Towering evergreens surrounded the property, their needles whispering secrets to the wind. A crystal-clear creek meandered through the heart of the lot, its babbling waters a soothing soundtrack to my every visit. There was even an old barn, weathered but still standing, its beams rich with the history of whoever had tended this land before me. A small clearing in the woods provided the perfect space for camping, with just enough open sky to watch the stars. This was the retreat I had envisioned, the place where I'd shake off the weight of the world and reconnect with what really mattered. My plan was simple: keep the land as a peaceful getaway. I'd spend my weekends clearing trails, tending to the wildflowers, and maybe one day build a small cabin. I wasn't in a hurry. The joy of owning this property was in the process, the freedom to shape it on my own terms. It wasn't just land, it was a canvas, untouched and entirely mine. Legally, there were no strings attached. When I purchased the property, the paperwork made it clear my land was independent of the HOA that governed the nearby community of Forest Peaks. That suited me just fine. I'd heard the horror stories, neighbors at war over mailbox colors, lawns scrutinized like museum exhibits. HOA rules weren't just restrictive, they were oppressive. My land wasn't part of their domain, and I intended to keep it that way. But life has a funny way of testing your peace just when you found it. For a while, everything was perfect. The weekends I spent out there felt like a deep exhale after years of holding my breath. I'd sit by the creek with a thermos of coffee, watching the sunlight dance on the water. But even paradise has its challenges, and mine arrived in the form of a power-hungry storm named Deborah Wilkins. Little did I know, she'd make it her mission to turn my sanctuary into a battlefield. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and I was working on clearing an old trail that snaked through the dense pines of my property. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, a refreshing contrast to the sterile office air I had been used to. My hands were blistered from the hours of wielding a machete, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that reminded me this land was truly mine to shape. I'd just taken a break, leaning against the old barn to admire my progress, when the sound of tires crunching gravel shattered the peace. I turned toward the entrance to my property, where a shiny white SUV had stopped just outside the gates. The door swung open, and out stepped a woman who looked like she had never seen a dirt road in her life. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed more suited to a boardroom than the edge of a forest. Her blonde bob gleamed in the sunlight, and she clutched a leather-bound notebook like it was a weapon. Even from a distance, her presence radiated authority, or at least the kind of authority that demands attention, but doesn't necessarily deserve it. She marched up to the gate with purpose, her heels clicking on the gravel despite the impracticality of her footwear. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that was just loud enough to be condescending. "Are you the owner of this property?" I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over, already sensing trouble. "I am. Can I help you?" "I'm Deborah Wilkins, president of the Forest Peaks Homeowners Association," she announced, as if her title should make me stand at attention. "And I'm here because your property is in direct violation of our community standards." I raised an eyebrow. "Community standards?" I said, keeping my tone calm. "This land isn't part of your HOA." Her lips tightened into a thin line, and she opened her notebook, flipping through the pages with theatrical flair. "All properties in this vicinity fall under the jurisdiction of the HOA," she said, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at the page. "And that includes yours. Frankly, this unkempt state is unacceptable. We have rules about aesthetics, and I must insist that you bring your property into compliance immediately." I couldn't help but chuckle. Ms. Wilkins, my land is private property. It's not part of your HOA, and it never has been. I have the deed and paperwork to prove it." She bristled, her cheeks flushing an angry red. "This kind of attitude is exactly why we need stronger enforcement," she snapped. "You can't just do whatever you want. This property reflects on the entire community, and we won't tolerate such disregard for the rules." I crossed my arms, planting my feet firmly on my side of the gate. "With all due respect, your HOA has no authority here. I don't answer to your rules, and I don't intend to start now." Her eyes narrowed, and her voice turned icy. "If you continue to ignore our regulations, there will be consequences. Fines, legal action, you name it. It would be much simpler if you just submitted a formal request to join the HOA and brought your property up to standard." "That's not going to happen," I said, my voice steady. "This land is mine, and I intend to keep it that way. Now, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate it if you left." For a moment, she seemed stunned that someone had dared to stand up to her. Then she snapped her notebook shut and gave me a look of pure disdain. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice low and venomous. "I'll make sure of it." With that, she spun on her heel and strode back to her SUV, the sound of her heels echoing long after she'd driven away. I stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle on the gravel road, a strange mixture of disbelief and unease washing over me. It seemed my peaceful retreat was about to become anything but. It didn't take long for Deborah to make good on her threats. A few days after our first encounter, I stepped outside my cabin to find a crisp, official-looking envelope wedged under my doormat. Inside was a notice from the Forest Peaks Homeowners Association informing me that my property had been officially annexed into the HOA. According to the letter, I was now subject to their bylaws and owed an immediate compliance fee. The document looked legitimate, watermarks, seals, the whole 9 yards, but I knew better. This was nothing more than a bluff wrapped in bureaucracy. I contacted my lawyer, who confirmed the obvious. The notice was completely fake. Still, the audacity of it left me fuming. Deborah wasn't just meddling. She was actively trying to rewrite reality to suit her agenda. Unfortunately, the bogus paperwork was just the beginning. A week later, my phone buzzed with an email alert from my homeowner's insurance company. They'd received a credible report that my property was a fire hazard due to improper maintenance and unpermitted structures. Until I addressed the issue, my policy was suspended. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind this. Deborah had decided to escalate her harassment, and now she was targeting my insurance. Furious, I spent hours documenting the pristine condition of my property and providing evidence that her claims were baseless. The insurance company eventually reinstated my policy, but the hassle was exhausting, and that was exactly her goal. Her campaign didn't stop there. A few neighbors confided in me that they'd received letters from the HOA accusing me of unauthorized occupation and environmental violations. According to these letters, I was squatting on public land and dumping waste into the creek. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, but I couldn't ignore the damage Deborah was doing to my reputation. Suddenly, polite nods from passing neighbors turned into suspicious glances. Then came the tours. One Saturday morning, I caught sight of Deborah leading a small group of well-dressed couples through my property. She gestured grandly at the clearing and creek, as if she were a real estate agent showcasing a prime development site. "This will make a wonderful addition to our community," I heard her say, her voice dripping with enthusiasm. I stepped out from behind the barn and confronted her, demanding to know what she thought she was doing. "Just a preliminary tour for potential buyers," she said with a smirk. "This land will soon be repurposed for the greater good." To make matters worse, my once pristine property began accumulating trash. Old tires, plastic bags, and even broken appliances started appearing overnight. I suspected it was Deborah's doing, a staged mess to justify her accusations of environmental violations. Sure enough, an environmental inspector showed up unannounced a few days later, armed with a clipboard and camera. It took hours of explanation and a walk through the rest of my untouched acreage to convince him that the debris wasn't mine. The final straw came when I returned from a weekend away to find several trees on my property cut down, their trunks neatly stacked as if ready for hauling. Newly carved trails crisscrossed my land, ruining the natural undergrowth. It was clear the HOA had sent workers to beautify the property without my knowledge or consent. Rare wildflowers I'd carefully avoided disturbing were trampled, their petals scattered like confetti. In response, I installed motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of my land. I also posted large, bold, private property signs at every entrance. Deborah, of course, had a response of her own. Within days, the signs had vanished, and the cameras had been repositioned to point at the ground. When I confronted her, she dismissed my efforts as tacky and out of alignment with community aesthetics. Frustrated but determined, I began documenting everything. I took photos of the damage, recorded video of her unauthorized tours, and kept copies of every fraudulent letter. My lawyer agreed we were building a solid case, but it felt like an uphill battle. Deborah's persistence wasn't just infuriating, it was relentless. Still, I refused to let her intimidate me. This was my land, and no amount of fabricated claims or underhanded tactics would change that. Returning to my property that morning, I expected to find the usual peace and quiet, a sanctuary where I could breathe and let go of the tension Deborah had been stirring up. Instead, I was greeted by the deafening roar of machinery and the sight of half a dozen workers swarming my land. Construction equipment was parked haphazardly across the clearing, and a freshly dug trench snaked through what used to be a patch of wildflowers. To my utter disbelief, scaffolding was being erected in what I could only assume was meant to be the foundation for some kind of structure. "Hey!" I shouted, marching toward the workers. "What the hell's going on here?" A man in a hard hat looked up, clearly startled. "We're here on HOA orders," he said, as if that explained everything. "This is slated for a community center, Olympic Peaks Welcome Pavilion, or something like that." I felt my blood boil. "This is my land," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Who gave you permission to build here?" Before he could answer, Deborah's unmistakable voice cut through the chaos. "Ah, Mr. Hale," she said, stepping out from behind a cluster of workers with her trademark smug expression. She was dressed far too formally for a construction site, clipboard in hand, as though she were presiding over a groundbreaking ceremony. "I'm glad you're here. I was going to notify you later today, but since you're already here, let me explain." I folded my arms, fixing her with a glare. "Explain why you're trespassing on my property and digging it up without my permission. This is no longer just your property," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "After reviewing the community's needs, the HOA board has decided to repurpose this land for the benefit of forest peaks. We've already filed the necessary paperwork to address the oversight in your deed." "Oversight in my deed?" I echoed, incredulous. "There's no oversight. I have legal documentation proving this is private property." Her expression hardened, her earlier mock politeness evaporating. "Then I suggest you take that up with the court. But I warn you, Mr. Hale, dragging this out will only cost you. By the time this is resolved, you'll be buried in the legal fees. You might as well save yourself the trouble and cooperate. The HOA is willing to compensate you, modestly." I couldn't believe her gall. "You want me to give you my land because you've decided it suits your plans? Think of it as a contribution to the community," she said with a patronizing smile, "or face bankruptcy trying to fight the inevitable." I walked away before I said something I'd regret, heading straight to my truck. As soon as I got inside, I called the police. When the officers arrived, I handed them every piece of documentation I had, the deed, the legal exemption from HOA oversight, everything. I also showed them the footage from my cameras. Deborah ripping down my private property signs, directing workers where to dig, and even laughing about how the land would finally be put to good use. The officers spent an hour questioning the workers, Deborah, and myself. It was clear the construction crew had been misled. They genuinely thought the HOA had authority to greenlight the project. Deborah, however, wasn't so fortunate. When the officers examined the paperwork she provided, it was riddled with inconsistencies and obvious forgeries. One officer pulled me aside. "This isn't just trespassing," he said quietly. "If what we're seeing holds up, she could be looking at charges for fraud, forgery, and maybe even embezzlement." That was the moment I realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. Deborah hadn't just targeted me. She'd been abusing her position for years. Further investigation revealed she had a pattern of targeting vulnerable property owners, fabricating violations, and seizing land under the guise of HOA authority. Funds meant for community improvements had been diverted into her personal accounts, and her network of enablers was beginning to unravel. When the case went to court, the evidence was overwhelming. My documentation, the camera footage, and testimony from former HOA board members painted a damning picture. Deborah wasn't just corrupt. She was a master manipulator who had built her empire on lies and intimidation. The judge ruled decisively in my favor, dismissing the HOA's claims and ordering Deborah to cease all activities related to my property. But the fallout for her was far worse. The HOA was fined heavily, and Deborah herself faced criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Her reign was over, and justice had finally prevailed. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict, her voice echoing with finality. This court finds in favor of Mr. Hale. The property in question remains under his sole ownership, exempt from the jurisdiction of the Forest Peaks Homeowners Association. A weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying lifted from my shoulders. It was over. My land, my sanctuary, was legally mine, and no one could challenge that again. The ruling didn't just confirm my ownership, it went further. The HOA was ordered to pay substantial compensation for the damage to my property and the emotional toll of Deborah's relentless harassment. As the judge listed the penalties, I glanced over at Deborah. Her smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a mask of disbelief and panic. For the first time since this nightmare began, she seemed to understand the depth of her downfall. But the real blow came when the charges against Deborah were read aloud. Fraud, forgery, trespassing, conspiracy, embezzlement. The list seemed endless. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the scope of her crimes was laid bare. The prosecutor presented a mountain of evidence, doctored documents, financial records showing misappropriated funds, and testimony from former HOA members who had finally come forward. Deborah's empire had crumbled, and now she was facing the consequences. 20 years in prison, the judge declared. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with the weight of a gavel slamming down on her fraudulent schemes. The ripple effects of her actions didn't stop there. The HOA, once a feared and overreaching entity, was effectively dismantled. The court ruled that its operations had been so corrupted under Deborah's leadership that it could no longer function. Its funds were seized, its bylaws nullified, and its authority stripped away. In its place, a new community committee was formed, overseen by local government to ensure transparency and fairness. For the first time in years, the residents of Forest Peaks could breathe easily, free from the iron grip of Deborah's rule. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I was met with a small crowd of neighbors. Some offered apologies. Others shared stories of their own battles with the HOA. Many simply wanted to shake my hand, thanking me for standing up to the corruption that had plagued the community for so long. Their support was humbling, and it reminded me that this fight hadn't just been for my land. It was for everyone who had been silenced or bullied by Deborah's reign of terror. Driving back to my property that evening, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The scars on my land would take time to heal, just as the scars from this ordeal would. But there was a sense of closure I hadn't felt in months. The land was quiet again, the way it was meant to be. The grove of trees stood tall, resilient despite the damage inflicted by Deborah's schemes. The creek bubbled on as if it had never been disturbed. The following weeks were a whirlwind of restoration. Workers cleared the debris left behind by the unauthorized construction, and I began replanting the wildflowers that had been trampled. I installed new, more robust signs marking the boundaries of my property, not out of fear, but as a reminder to anyone who might consider testing my resolve. I also upgraded my surveillance system, though I doubted I'd need it again. Deborah's lesson was one the community wouldn't soon forget. In the months that followed, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Without the oppressive oversight of the HOA, residents began to reconnect. A new sense of unity emerged as people realized they no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary fines or vindictive rules. The newly formed community committee prioritized transparency and fairness, giving everyone a voice. Block parties replaced board meetings, and collaboration replaced conflict. For me, the victory wasn't just about keeping my land, it was about reclaiming peace. Sitting by the creek one evening, the stars beginning to twinkle above, I felt a profound gratitude for the journey I'd endured. The fight had been grueling, but it was worth every sleepless night, every tense confrontation, to preserve what mattered most. My land was my refuge once more, a testament to resilience and the power of standing firm against injustice. The aftermath of the court case felt like stepping into a new chapter, not just for me, but for the entire community. My first priority was securing my land, ensuring that no one could challenge its boundaries or my ownership again. I upgraded my surveillance system, adding motion-activated cameras and discreetly placed sensors along the perimeter. I also replaced the simple private property signs with bold, unmistakable markers, leaving no room for doubt about the land's ownership. These changes weren't just practical. They gave me back a sense of control over the sanctuary I had worked so hard to protect. With the threat of intrusion behind me, I finally turned my attention to what I had originally planned: building a home. Sketching out designs and envisioning a modest cabin surrounded by towering trees brought a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about creating a place to live, it was about honoring the land that had endured so much. Progress was slow but deliberate, and for the first time in months, my weekends were filled with the joy of creation rather than the stress of defense. What surprised me most in the months that followed was the way my property became a symbol of resilience for the community. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped by to chat, offering everything from advice on native plants to help with trail maintenance. I decided to open part of the land to those who wanted to enjoy its beauty as long as they respected the space. Families started coming by for nature walks, and kids explored the trails with wide-eyed wonder. It was a reminder that this land wasn't just mine. It could be a source of joy for others as well. The broader community also underwent a transformation. Without the oppressive shadow of the HOA, forest peaks began to flourish. Neighbors organized cleanup days and potluck dinners, turning what had once been a tense and fractured neighborhood into a thriving and friendly one. The shared struggle against Deborah's tyranny created bonds that hadn't existed before. The tale of her downfall and my fight to preserve my land became a local legend, a story passed around at block parties and bonfires as a reminder that standing up for what's right can change everything. As I sat by the creek one quiet evening, the sound of water blending with the hum of distant laughter from a neighborhood gathering, I realized the fight had been worth it. The land was not only mine, it had become a testament to the strength of community and the value of perseverance. The air was crisp, the sun casting dappled patterns through the trees as I sat by the creek, coffee mug in hand. The water bubbled over smooth stones, its rhythm steady and unchanging, a constant in a world that had felt anything but. This was the peace I had been fighting for, the quiet I had imagined when I first walked these 6 acres. It hadn't come easily, but that made it all the sweeter. Reflecting on the battle with Deborah and the HOA, I realized how much I'd learned about resilience. There were moments when giving in might have seemed easier, but letting go of what was mine, what was right, was never an option. The experience had been exhausting and at times infuriating, but it had shown me the importance of standing firm against injustice. It wasn't just about preserving my land, it was about protecting the principles that allow people to live freely and peacefully. The fight had left its mark on me, but it had also strengthened me in ways I hadn't expected. What I didn't anticipate was how my story would ripple through the community. People I barely knew started reaching out, sharing their own struggles, and thanking me for setting a precedent. "You showed us we don't have to back down," one neighbor told me during a local cookout. It was humbling to hear, knowing my ordeal had inspired others to reclaim their confidence and assert their rights. Cold Springs had changed too. Without the oppressive presence of the HOA, the town had become lighter, more welcoming. Neighbors who had once lived in quiet fear of fines and judgments now greeted one another with genuine warmth. Block parties and shared projects replaced board meetings and grievances. Even those who had initially sided with Deborah seemed relieved to be free from her influence, finally able to enjoy their homes without constant scrutiny. As for my land, it had become more than just a retreat for me. It was a shared treasure. Trails I had cleared were now explored by families and kids, their laughter echoing through the forest. I had set a few simple rules: leave no trace, respect the space, and enjoy it as much as I did. To my delight, everyone embraced the spirit of the land, treating it with the care it deserved. Sitting there that day, watching the light fade and the stars begin to dot the sky, I felt a deep gratitude. For the land, yes, but also for the journey. The struggles had tested me, but they'd also revealed the strength of community and the value of persistence. Cold Springs wasn't just a better place, it was a closer one where neighbors looked out for one another, united by a shared understanding of respect and justice. The creek's murmur reminded me of a truth I'd come to cherish. Peace isn't something handed to you. It's something you earn, something you fight for when necessary. And sometimes the fight for what's right doesn't just protect what you love, it brings people together in ways you never imagined.